Gotta get all my gadgets. Tansi. Achakus kakanoita squeo kinoseo dodem. I want to say good morning to everybody, and I just introduced myself in my spirit name. And in English, it translates to Spirit Keeper of the Stars Woman. And as Tracy said, I'm from the Fish Clan. I want to acknowledge the territory, the Coast Salish peoples, territory that we're all standing on in this moment. And I want to say miigwech to Ending Violence Association for your very, very warm welcome and for inviting me back to British Columbia. When I got off the plane, I thought, oh my God, it's so different than Toronto. You actually don't have to pay for a luggage cart here. I'm going to just apologize in advance in that I'm looking at a monitor, and I was thinking here, this is very new for me to look at the monitor, and I was thinking, you know, maybe it's a little bit like Barack Obama in giving the State of Union address. So forgive me if I'm sometimes looking down at the monitor. So I wanted to start off with a quote from a very dear friend of mine, Pauline Shirt. She's from Saddle Lake First Nation. She's an elder who's kind of migrated. She has migrated to Toronto, and she's a traditional elder, grandmother, and she's been working with the communities for the Toronto community for over 30 years. And this is a quote that I've had the honor to travel with her across Ontario doing prevention and education work. And so she basically says, when a man chooses to use violence towards a woman, he is dispiriting her. He is changing the very spirit she entered the world as. And I can absolutely relate to the dispiriting because it's part of my experience as an Aboriginal woman. And colonization has affected me in maybe, you know, in a different way. And throughout this next half hour, I want to talk and weave in a little bit about my story. And so who am I? When I was 2 years old, I was born in Edmonton, and I was with my birth mom, Caroline Teresa Swan. And at the age of 2.5, I went into foster care. And then I was adopted into a Dutch family at the age of 3. And I understand dispiriting because what happened was I did not know who I was. And my spirit was broken. And when I was in high school, and I got called for the first time in my life, because I grew up in a non-native home, and for the first time in my life in my art class, and the young man said to me, "Oh, shut up, you effing squaw." It was a huge, 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 huge impact for me, right there in my heart, right there in my spirit. And then in that moment, I realized, oh my God, I'm different. Who am I? And what I did was I proceeded to self-destruct. And by the time I was 25, I almost died from drinking. And I'm very, very grateful to stand before you today and say that in the healing of my spirit, that I have, this year will be 27 years sober. And what saved my life was coming back to the culture. That was my experience. When I came back, I was able to truly pick up myself and really understand who I was in my identity. My mother, Caroline Teresa Swan, who was known as Terry Swan as well, took her life shortly after me and my sister were put into Children's Aid. And so my mother never ever got the help that she needed. And truly, 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 her life was she was completely dispirited. And so in legacy of my mother, I took my mother's name. It's not my legal name, but I took her name, Terry Swan, just to remember her life. So that's how colonization, intergenerational trauma, a couple of examples of how colonization and intergenerational trauma have affected my life, my birth mother's life. And to this day, I don't know who my father is. And to this day, I'm a non-status Indian woman. Because within the Indian Act, if you are not able to identify who your father is, you do not get status, and you don't have treaty rights. So those are just some examples of how colonization have affected me. Oops, sorry. So one of the things that I want to, Wendy talked about this morning. She talked about Aboriginal women, Indigenous women, we held unique roles and responsibilities to our nations and to the Creator. And we were always honored, and we have always known that we have that beautiful gift, that responsibility of that water and that beautiful gift to bring life into this world. But we've always, we have an essential principle also across our nations that our collective existence depends upon our ability to demonstrate respect and to provide safety and security for the women of our nations. And within our original teachings, if we were to go back in time, and we totally understood holistic lifestyle, that we understood when we were given those original instructions of how we were to take care of ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And that we understand that our ceremonies, we have everything that we have within our cultures to take care of ourselves. And that beautiful jingle dress that you see at powwows is not just a jingle dress to look at, that there's a story behind that, and that it's actually a healing dress, and that we can call upon this ceremony that goes with the jingle dress to ask for healing for ourselves and for our nations. That we also understand that we are connected to all living things. We're connected to the stars, we're connected to the earth, we're connected to the water, and that the only difference that we have as human beings is that we have been given a mind to think. And that we understand that every decision that we make today is going to affect the next 7 generations. We had governance structures that were very, very clearly guided our communities, political structures on how we dealt with other nations, economic structures on how we traded with other nations, legal structures on how we dealt with people who may have done harm to somebody else. Education, our education came from the elders. It came with understanding our connection to the land. And we had our own social processes. And basically, if you were born into a clan system, when you're born into a clan system, you automatically understand your roles and responsibilities. Language is so important. If I now know today, Nihio Squeo, what does that mean? It means I am a woman, I am a Cree woman of the land. I understand that all the decisions that I make are for the children, awasis, the children, because the direct translation of awasis in Cree is the inheritors. It's wrong to assume that we didn't have any kind of violence in our communities, because we did. And just as I said, if somebody hurt somebody else, there was always very, very clear protocol on how we would take care of that. In the Navajo tradition, when a man violated a woman, all the women would come together and they'd go into the hogan and they'd grab all of his stuff and very nicely and gently put it outside, and he was kicked out of the home. Jake Swamp, who's a late elder, his wife, Judy Swamp, she says, "What man in his right mind would ever hurt a woman?" Because what happened was he was always, it was the women, it was the grandmothers, it was the aunties that surrounded around the women to take care of her. And so she says, no, what man in his right mind would hurt a woman? So we had very, very clear protocol on how we would take care of those relationships that where somebody had hurt somebody else. And then it was prophesized and we had colonization. Colonization process created new governments, new policies, new legislation, and institutions which were to govern Aboriginal people's actions, including the care of our children. And Wendy referred to this already in regards to the Indian Act. The very first thing it did, patriarchal, most racist act, Native people are the most legislative people in this country, was that it took away the role of women in decision-making processes. This is a remarkable photo. It's from Jan Longboat. She's Mohawk from Six Nations in Ontario. It's from the Truth and Reconciliation Aboriginal Healing Foundation. This picture kind of blows me away in that here you have never how we were intended to live through the assimilation policies, through the, we actually have today 127,000 children, our children are in care. That's 3 times more than there ever was in the residential schools. So as I traveled across Ontario, one of the quotes that came from the women was, "I'm a survivor of violence since the day of my conception." And that just blew me away. I just think, my God, we have so normalized the violence in our communities. I was up in Kenora doing training, and I had 50 Native women in the audience, freezing cold, minus 50, Kenora's in Northern Ontario. And I just was doing the very basic power and control wheel. And after that, women came and found me in the hallway, and they found me in the elevator. And you know what they said? "I now know I'm being abused." Our women don't even necessarily know that they're being abused. So we need to understand that the violence found in Aboriginal communities didn't start in the relationships within our families, but has roots outside of the family, in colonization, in historical and current violence against Aboriginal peoples, and in the social economic status of many Aboriginal families. It absolutely remains the constant thread connecting the different forms of violence against Aboriginal women and girls in Canada. And Indigenous women and girls are facing the most pervasive human rights crisis in Canada. We have Aboriginal families that have still not been given any kind of justice based on a human rights violation that has happened to one of their family members. Aboriginal women today continue to go missing or be murdered with no action from any level of government to address these tragedies or gendered violence or the poverty or the racism or the colonialism. And as said by Joyce Green, professor of political sciences, she says, while sexism devalues all women relative to men, racism devalues Indigenous women because of who they are, Indigenous in relation to white people. So the whole culture of disposable women needs to change drastically before the eradication of the colonial underpinning of the past can occur. And the inquiry that Tracy talks about, absolutely, it seems like it's just perpetuating this systemic bias and discrimination. And it absolutely highlights the disturbing worldwide culture of impunity that allows murders of women, especially those who are poor, Indigenous, or sex workers, to go unsolved and unpunished. And so what happens is if you're not directly connected to these experiences, you're part of the disconnection. And that's probably the biggest and greatest apathy in Canadian society. If you're not part of it, you're disconnected. And what Aboriginal women need to know is they need to know that you know that this is happening in this country. And when we start talking about risk management, it's very, very difficult sometimes to talk about risk management because it's really hard to put risk management strategies in place when an Aboriginal woman is consistently placed in survival mode related to issues of poverty, food security, housing, or homelessness. And an Aboriginal approach to safety planning is in everyday living. Violence is a big part of an Aboriginal woman's life. And, you know, the threat assessment tools, you need to understand that those tools, some of those tools, like, for example, the danger assessment tool, the Alberta Women's Council the Women's Council of Shelters, has done remarkable work. They just did a study around Jacqueline Campbell's danger assessment tool, and they found that the tool needed to be revised to be much more reflective of an Aboriginal women's experience. And what they found was the tool is, that specific tool talks about intimate partner violence, right? It's 20 questions, so women can actually assess their own risk of lethality. And it talks about intimate partner violence, but because family violence is so pervasive and so big in our communities, that question is now being changed to family violence, because it's not just intimate partners murdering our women. It can be our uncles, it can be our grandfathers, it can be other men, and so it's so related to family violence. So it's not just intimate partner violence. Another question as an example is, are there any firearms in the home? Or has she ever been threatened with a firearm, with a gun? Yeah, with a firearm. And that question got changed because our women have been threatened with much more than just a firearm. So that threat assessment tool, and I congratulate Alberta for revising it. It's just about to be released, and they're going to do a training program on it where it's just much more relevant to Aboriginal women's experience. Safety planning is going to look really different across your province, across my province. We have 56 fly-in communities in Northern Ontario. And I remember when one of the chiefs got up, women chiefs got up, and she said, safety planning in my community looks like this. So when you grab a sleeping bag, and you grab some food, and you grab your children, you go to the bush until everything is calmed down. So those are some of the, those are some of the things that we need to, need to look at when we're talking about violence against Aboriginal women. I think the number one, so many of our women don't report. It's so normalized, but there's also such a lack of resources for our women to access, and there's huge issues of confidentiality and safety. Huge, 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 in that women don't want to disclose in smaller communities because the perpetrator is the chief of the band. Women don't want to disclose in small communities because the perpetrator is the First Nations police. So in 2008, the Prime Minister gave an apology and acknowledged that residential school was one of the most soul-wounding experiences that continues on to this day. And so I love what Mary Simon says, president of the Inuit Taparit Kanatami Association. She says, it's not enough to give an apology. Apologies are not solutions. What we need in this country is a national action plan. What we need is Aboriginal leadership to honor Aboriginal women and walk alongside of us and give us the resources and put us in our rightful place as Aboriginal women leaders. We need the authorities to take responsibility. Police need to be educated. So we need to really be working on solutions. And so Tracy mentioned in the province of Ontario, one of the solutions was that we got together after a national Violence Against Aboriginal Women Summit. The provincial government of Ontario brought the Aboriginal women stakeholders together and said, how do you want to proceed? And we said, you have just released a domestic violence action plan. It is not appropriate. It does not meet our needs. We will consult and talk to Aboriginal women ourselves, and we will ask them, what do you need in order to prevent and work on violence against Aboriginal women? So the Ontario Native Women's Association and the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres launched the Strategic Framework to End Violence Against Aboriginal Women. It's based on 11 principles, the very first principle saying that all violence against Aboriginal women must end. And there's 8 specific areas for change in the area of research, legal reform, policy programs, education, community development, leadership, and accountability. And what happened as a result of that, tremendous amount of political will, movement forward, And there's an interministerial working group committee that works with the Aboriginal organizations and the Aboriginal leadership to continue to move the strategic framework forward. So it's continually evolving. There's accountability because the Aboriginal organizations said, you always want us to be accountable to you for all the funding that we give you. We need you to be accountable back to us and tell us, what have you done to move the strategic framework forward? So every 2 or 3 years, we produce a report card. Plus, this particular interministerial group is led by the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs and the Ontario Women's Directorate. And every year, the Aboriginal leadership has an opportunity to sit with the 2 ministers and be able to say, the ministers get to report back to the Aboriginal community, and the Aboriginal community gets to have a dialogue with them. It needs to be, this strategic framework is ongoing, it's collaborative. It's the only way that it works between government and the Aboriginal partners. And the most recent, just before I left the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres, we had a consultation because the province, after they released the Domestic Violence Action Plan, they released a Sexual Violence Action Plan. And again, we went back to the government. We said, this Sexual Violence Action Plan does not meet our needs, and that we, as an Aboriginal community, must have a consultation. And we did. And I was there. It was the last, one of the last responsibilities I had. There was 40 of us around the circle, all Aboriginal women. Not one of us had not experienced some form of sexual violence. And while we were there, this is tragic, it just really, really hit me. We had the executive director of Sioux Lookout, which is in northern services the flying communities. It's the one shelter in Ontario that's always at capacity. It's really important to understand that every single Aboriginal woman that goes into that shelter is also dealing with 100% addictions. But while we were there, there was a hockey tournament up in Sioux Lookout. 12-year-old found murdered and raped up alongside of the community hall while we were in the Sexual Violence Action Plan. Young Native woman. I mean, we're not woman, child. You know, and I'm on Facebook and I'm on the Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women sites. There is not one day that goes by that you don't see. And our women, and we're talking teenagers, we're talking about youth, we're talking about children that go missing across this country. So the Sexual Violence Action Plan, we understood that we can't just start, there must be safety and care for the individual, for the family, and for the community before we move forward in beginning to discuss this issue, because it's pervasive and we must do it with great, great care. And so I was asked to speak a little bit about working with Aboriginal communities or Aboriginal women. And so working with Aboriginal women, their families and communities requires that you work from a level of consciousness that allows you to consider an Indigenous worldview. And by stepping into an Indigenous worldview, you will experience a different way of understanding and being in the world. So that requires taking risks. Within the Indigenous world, the act of coming to know something involves a personal transformation. When your spirit is touched, and so Tracy talked about you want to all be transformed. When you know when your spirit will be touched in the next 2 days, perhaps it already has been. And when your spirit is touched, clearly, 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 that is when personal transformation and learning happens. And that's the one difference. Pauline Shirt, she always talks to me about spirit. She says, it's the most important thing that we have. She said, it's the most important thing, our spirit. She said, the spirit never dies. And so the real big difference between perhaps mainstream and Aboriginal is we always, always, always acknowledge the spiritual realm. So you need to understand that your own individual actions can reinforce colonial attitudes or recognize the complexity of families' lives. So we ask that you engage with us on what we need to do to make things better for ourselves. And I think one of the things that's that I'd like to share with you is that when you step into an Indigenous worldview and you can create that empathy and self-reflection, that you are helping us to heal as a nation. There is not a doubt in my mind that you have taken the time working frontline in the violence against women sector to understand the historical context of violence against Aboriginal women. And when you do that, clearly, you are helping us each. You are helping the women you're working with, you're helping our families, and you are helping us to heal as a nation. So you all, as healers and as helpers, play a crucial role in helping us to rebuild our communities. Just going back for 1 second for the strategic framework to end violence against Aboriginal women, we invited Jacqueline Aguta and Terry George from the Cherokee Nation to come and present at one of our summits, at one of our consultations while we were writing that document. And I believe that the document's on your flash drive. Because you may or may not know that the United States has Violence Against Women Protection Act. And the American Indian and Alaskan women community negotiated within the United States government for a $100 million set-aside for North American Alaskan Indian women. And so we wanted to hear from Jacqueline and Terry, how did you do that? How did you negotiate $100 million set aside for the tribes in the States? She said, well, we could have never done it if it wasn't for mainstream feminist, white feminist organizations. We would have never accomplished our task. And she said, because and the mainstream feminist organizations were the ones that said, Aboriginal women need a separate strategy, and we're advocating, and we're supporting them, and we're walking alongside of them. So I think it's really important to know that we all have roles in ending violence, in this particular case against Aboriginal women. So your role as a helper and as a healer is that we do have 4 great laws, and they were handed down by creation. And those 4 great laws are the laws of sharing and caring and kindness and love. Those were our original instructions. And when you're working with Aboriginal families, they are going to be looking for evidence that show that you respect Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. So we have the concept of cultural safety, which came out of the Maori culture in New Zealand. And it really absolutely moves beyond the idea that everyone's to be treated the same. It enables safe services to be defined by those who receive the service. And it absolutely, again, is about self-reflection and empathy. So that we ask you, wherever you are, I only found out last night that you have over 200 First Nation communities in British Columbia. You have an incredibly diverse group of First Nation groups. I think we have 11 language groups in all of Canada, and you have 7 different languages in this province. So what are you doing to invest in building relationships and partners? Because we know that Aboriginal women obviously have a right to choose what service that they want to go to, and many of our women choose to be serviced by mainstream organizations. And I think I told you why in regards to confidentiality and safety and all of those other things. So you'll want to build trust and provide a safe, confidential environment to encourage and support Native women to share their story. And that's probably the most crucial thing that I could share with you. Because of the incredible shame and unresolved grief in our communities that we walk with every single day, we carry that. And I know, working frontline for years, that the only antidote to shame is to talk about it. So can you provide a safe and confidential place or experience for women to share their story? In Ontario, we did a feasibility study to look at implementing the very first provincial assaulted women's helpline. And the number one thing that came back in regards to the feasibility study when we asked our women was confidentiality was the number one issue. So it is huge, and we need to talk about how we're going to break down those barriers and provide safe space. So I would ask, do you go to the community meetings and introduce yourself in a situation where Aboriginal people have set the process and the context? We are constantly, consistently having to step into your world. We ask and invite you to step into ours. And ask if there's a protocol to come into the community when you have programs. Always learn the community history and make yourself aware of any current affairs that are impacting them. Create spaces for Aboriginal participation on boards and committees. When you run training programs, invite Indigenous Aboriginal trainers. That provides safety for, first of all, maybe your one Aboriginal staff that you have. But it creates this safety where you'll see, if you have an Aboriginal trainer, I can guarantee you that the Aboriginal women, especially the staff, that's something that we can relate to and that, open up and really feel that safety. Incorporate Aboriginal inclusion into governance documents. Talk with community stakeholders such as workers in Aboriginal organizations. So the process is very important. It takes time to develop the trust that allows the process to happen. And in my culture and in my teachings, that's in that southern doorway. And in that southern doorway, we have the teaching of time and relationships. If there's anything, there's nothing more important than relationships. Our relationships with ourselves, our relationship with our Mother, the Earth, our relationship with each other. And it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight, that you have to keep nurturing. Just as that strategic framework, it takes time. But you never, ever give up, and you always continue to nurture these relationships. And it also takes time to understand the Aboriginal protocols and how to work in a respectful way. So leadership is the highest spiritual calling. And as leaders, which each and every person in this room is a leader, the starting point begins with you, managing your whole self by utilizing the spirit that lies within your identity and the strength of your culture. And I talked to Pauline, I said, what do I say to the non-Aboriginal people about how to work, or how we can work together? She says, you tell them, she said, you say to them, ask them what their creation story is. I said, they don't know it. Every culture has a creation story, and every creation story is true. So do you know who you are, where you came from, who your family is, what your community is, and who your nation is? And do you understand that in your heart? Have you made that journey from your head to your heart? Have you made that journey from your heart to your head? And so, in closing, we're at this doorway that, how I understand it, and that is in that northern doorway. And it is the place of healing. And in my teachings, the great white medicine bear sits in this doorway. And they say that there's nothing that the bear cannot heal. And we acknowledge the strength and the resiliency of Aboriginal women, of Aboriginal cultures. And there is a great healing movement happening. And so we ask each and every person in here that indeed you become partners in helping us to rebuild our cultures and the families, and how significant the role is that each and every one of you have. If you watched just recently the 8th fire, it's a prophecy, and the time is now. The time has arrived. There is no more waiting around. There is no more them over there, these ones over here. That we must come together with the unity of a vision to end violence against women. And what would it look like if indeed we were to actually all unleash our spirituality? What would that really look like, and to heal our spirits? So the 8th fire says to pick up our medicine, that each and every one of us has medicine. Each and every one of us has a role. And that we come together and we do the work together as a people. And so I'm going to leave you with the Maori from the New Zealand proverb. And it says, with your basket of knowledge and with my basket of knowledge, indeed, absolutely, our people will prosper. Hai hai, miigwech. Miigwech.